Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I'd always been drawn to desolate places, those forgotten corners of the world where silence pressed against your eardrums and the vastness made you feel insignificant. Monument Valley was exactly that kind of place. A landscape that seemed carved by some ancient, indifferent force. The massive sandstone monoliths jutted from the earth like tombstones of forgotten giants, their red surfaces glowing molten in the dying light of day. It was late October 2018, and I'd been driving for 3 days straight, running from a life that had become unbearable. The divorce papers were signed, the job was gone, and the apartment felt like a mausoleum of failed dreams. This trip wasn't planned. It was an escape, a desperate attempt to find something, anything, that might restore meaning to my existence. The rental car's engine hummed steadily as I navigated the main tourist routes during daylight hours, capturing images with my camera that would never be seen by anyone but myself. But as evening approached, something compelled me to venture off the beaten path. Perhaps it was the photographer's instinct for that perfect, untouched shot. Or maybe it was something darker, a subconscious desire to push myself toward danger. The dirt road appeared suddenly between two weathered rock formations, barely wide enough for a vehicle. No signs marked its entrance, no warnings about where it led or what lay beyond. The rational part of my mind suggested I turn back, but I was beyond rational thinking. The setting sun painted the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, and I convinced myself I could capture something extraordinary down that nameless path. Red dust billowed behind me as I drove deeper into the wilderness, each mile taking me further from safety and civilization. The GPS signal had died within the first half hour, but I felt confident I could retrace my route. The landscape was distinctive enough, that towering spire ahead, the distinctive arch formation to my left, the scattered boulders that looked like sleeping animals in the fading light. But confidence is a fragile thing in the desert, and mine began to crumble as the sun disappeared entirely behind the western mesas. The temperature dropped with startling suddenness, and what had been a warm, inviting landscape transformed into something hostile and alien. The shadows between the rocks deepened into pools of absolute blackness, and the familiar landmarks began to look different, distorted, as if the desert itself was shifting around me. That's when the car began to show the first signs of distress. A subtle vibration in the steering wheel, a slight hesitation in the engine's rhythm. I tried to ignore these warning signs, pressing deeper into the maze of dirt roads and unmarked paths. But the desert had other plans. The engine died with a final choking gasp that echoed off the surrounding stone walls like the death rattle of some massive beast. One moment I was driving steadily forward, headlights cutting through the gathering darkness, and the next I was sitting in absolute silence, watching my dashboard lights flicker and fade like dying stars. My first reaction was denial. I turned the key again, pumping the gas pedal and listening to the starter motor grind uselessly. The sound was harsh and mechanical in the profound silence of the desert, but it was comforting in its familiarity. At least something was working, even if it wasn't accomplishing anything useful. After several minutes of futile attempts, I was forced to accept the reality of my situation. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no cell phone service and no clear idea of how to get back to civilization. The road I'd followed had branched and twisted so many times that retracing my path on foot would be nearly impossible, even in daylight. I stepped out of the car, and the silence hit me like a physical force. There were no sounds of traffic, no aircraft overhead, no distant hum of civilization. Even the typical desert sounds, the scurrying of small animals, the rustle of vegetation in the wind, were absent. It was as if the entire landscape was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. The air was much colder than I'd expected, carrying a sharp edge that cut through my light jacket and made me shiver. Above, stars began to appear in vast numbers, their light too distant and cold to provide any real illumination. The moon was just a sliver, offering little help in navigating the treacherous terrain that surrounded me. I popped the hood and examined the engine by the light of my phone's flashlight, though I knew virtually nothing about automotive repair. Everything looked normal to me. No obvious leaks, no loose wires, no smoking components. The battery terminals were clean and tight. The oil levels seemed adequate, and I couldn't detect any unusual odors that might indicate a specific problem. Frustration mounting, I slammed the hood shut with more force than necessary. The metallic crash reverberated through the desert like a gunshot, and in the echo that followed, I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling somewhere in the darkness beyond my limited field of vision. They moved with an odd, uneven rhythm, as if the person making them was injured or walking with some kind of difficulty. But there was something else about the sound, something that triggered an immediate flight response in my primitive brain. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady and authoritative. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped immediately, but the silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. It was the silence of a predator that had just realized its prey was aware of its presence. I swept my flashlight beam in a wide arc, but it illuminated only empty desert, scattered rocks, and the twisted shapes of dead vegetation. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, drowning out any other sounds that might give me a clue about what was out there. I climbed back into the car and locked the doors, knowing that the thin metal and glass would provide little protection against a determined human attacker, but needing the psychological comfort of a barrier between myself and whatever was lurking in the darkness. Through the windshield, I could see the outline of a large rock formation about 50 yards ahead, its surface carved into strange shapes by millennia of wind and weather. As I watched, a shadow moved across its face, not the slow drift of a cloud, but something quick and purposeful. Something that suggested a human form, but wrong somehow, distorted in ways that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on it. I blinked hard and looked again, but whatever I'd seen was gone. The rock face was blank and motionless, innocent of any movement. But the feeling of being watched remained, an almost physical pressure that seemed to press against my skull from all sides. My camera bag was on the passenger seat, and I reached for it with trembling hands, thinking that perhaps I could document whatever was happening to me. If nothing else, the images might serve as evidence if I didn't survive the night. But as I powered on the camera, something impossible happened. The shutter clicked, capturing an image without any input from me. I stared at the camera's LCD screen in horror as a photograph appeared. A view of my car from outside, taken from a position perhaps 20 feet behind the rear bumper. And standing in the background, barely visible in the shadows but unmistakably human-shaped, was a tall figure watching me through the rear window. I spun around, looking through the back windshield, but saw nothing but empty road and darkness. My hands shook as I tried to delete the image, but before I could complete the action, the camera clicked again. Another photograph appeared on the screen, this one taken from a position closer to the driver's side window. The figure was nearer now, close enough that I could make out details that filled me with dread. It was impossibly tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its clothing appeared to be traditional Native American garments, but they hung on the figure like funeral shrouds, moving in a wind that didn't seem to affect anything else in the photograph. But it was the face that truly terrified me, or rather, the absence of a face. Where features should have been, there was only shadow, a void that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I fumbled for the ignition key, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grasp it. The engine turned over weakly but refused to start, producing only a grinding sound that seemed to echo mockingly through the desert air. I tried again, then again, panic rising in my throat like bile. A soft tapping sound came from the passenger side window, gentle, almost polite, like someone asking for directions. But the politeness of it somehow made it more terrifying than if something had been trying to smash its way into the car. This was the tap of something that was confident in its power, something that could afford to be patient. I forced myself to look toward the sound, and my breath caught in my throat. Standing beside the car was an elderly man, his face deeply lined and weathered, wearing traditional clothing that seemed to belong to another century. His gray hair was long and braided, and his eyes held a kindness that would have been comforting under different circumstances. But these weren't different circumstances, and nothing about this situation was natural or safe. The man had appeared from nowhere, in the middle of a desert where no one should have been walking, and my camera had somehow been taking pictures of him before he'd made himself known. He leaned down and spoke through the window, his voice muffled but clearly audible. "Are you having car trouble, my friend? This is not a safe place to be stranded at night." Every instinct I possessed screamed at me not to open the window, not to trust this seemingly helpful stranger. But he appeared harmless, even frail, and I was desperately in need of assistance. Perhaps he had a cell phone, or knew of a nearby settlement where I could get help. I cracked the window perhaps an inch, just enough to speak clearly. "My car broke down," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you know how to get back to the main road?" The old man smiled, but there was something wrong with his expression. His teeth seemed too sharp, too numerous, filling his mouth in ways that defied anatomy. "Oh yes, I know these roads very well. But you shouldn't travel them at night. Dangerous things happen in the darkness out here." As he spoke, I noticed that his reflection in my side mirror looked different from what I was seeing directly. In the mirror, his face was older, more gaunt, with eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. The traditional clothing appeared tattered and stained, as if it had been worn for decades without being cleaned or repaired. "There's a safe place nearby," he continued, his voice taking on a hypnotic quality that made my eyelids feel heavy. "A place where you can wait until morning. Just follow me." He pointed into the darkness away from the road, toward a landscape of broken rocks and deep shadows where no sane person would venture on foot. But as he pointed, I saw lights in the distance. Warm, welcoming lights that suggested buildings and people and safety. The lights flickered like candles in the wind, creating an inviting glow that seemed to promise warmth and shelter from the cold desert night. But something about them felt wrong, like a mirage that would disappear the moment I tried to approach. The old man waited patiently beside my window, his smile never wavering, his strange eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You don't understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I can't leave my car. Someone might come along and help." His smile widened, showing even more of those impossibly sharp teeth. "No one comes down this road after dark," he replied. "No one except those who are lost like yourself. And the lost, they don't always find their way back." As he spoke, I became aware of other sounds in the darkness. Low growls and snuffling noises, like a pack of large dogs circling just beyond the range of my headlights. But there was something human about the sounds too, as if people were making animal noises, or animals were trying to speak like people. The old man noticed my distraction and chuckled softly. "They're hungry," he said matter-of-factly. "It's been a long time since someone came this way. A long time since we've had company." That was when I knew with absolute certainty that I was in the presence of something evil. The helpful facade dropped away completely, replaced by a predatory intensity that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't human, despite its appearance. and the lights in the distance weren't a settlement. They were a trap, designed to lure desperate travelers away from the relative safety of the road. I rolled up the window as quickly as I could, but the old man made no move to stop me. Instead, he began to change. His body elongated impossibly, his limbs stretching like rubber, his face distorting into something that belonged in a nightmare. His clothes fell away like old rags, revealing gray, mottled skin covered in what looked like crude tattoos or ritual scars. The thing that had pretended to be a helpful stranger began to move around the car with fluid, inhuman grace. It pressed its transformed face against each window in turn, leaving streaks of condensation that looked disturbingly like saliva. Its breathing was audible through the glass, rapid, eager, like a dog that had caught the scent of fresh meat. I tried the ignition again, and to my amazement, the engine coughed to life. The dashboard lights flickered on, and the radio burst into static so loud it made my ears ring. I threw the car into drive and pressed the accelerator to the floor, spraying gravel and dust as I fled down the dark road. But the creature wasn't finished with me. As I accelerated, something heavy landed on the roof of the car with a metallic crash that sent shockwaves through the entire vehicle. Long claws or fingers scraped against the metal above my head, creating a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard amplified 1,000 times. The weight on the roof shifted and moved as I swerved desperately from side to side, trying to dislodge whatever had attached itself to my car. The scraping sounds continued, accompanied by what could only be described as laughter. A high, keening sound that spoke of madness and hunger and things that should not exist in the natural world. My headlights swept wildly across the landscape as I fought to maintain control on the rough dirt road. Rocks and cacti flashed past like ghostly sentinels, and more than once I felt the wheels leave the ground as I hit unseen bumps and potholes. The speedometer needle climbed steadily, 30, 40, 50 miles per hour on a road that was barely safe at half that speed. The creature on my roof seemed to be enjoying the ride. Its claws dug deeper into the metal, creating anchor points that allowed it to maintain its grip despite my erratic driving. Through the roof, I could hear it moving around, repositioning itself, occasionally tapping out a rhythm that sounded almost like a song. In my rearview mirror, I caught glimpses of other shapes pursuing us on foot, keeping pace with the car despite the impossible speed. They moved with the fluid grace of predators, bounding across the rough terrain as easily as if they were running on smooth pavement. Their eyes reflected the red glow of my taillights, creating the impression of floating embers in the darkness. The road ahead split into two branches, and I had to make a split-second decision about which way to go. The left fork seemed to head toward higher ground, possibly offering a better vantage point and a chance to see lights from civilization. The right fork curved downward into what looked like a canyon or arroyo, a place where I could easily become trapped. I chose left, and immediately regretted it. The road became even rougher, barely more than a game trail carved into the rocky hillside. My car scraped against protruding stones, and I heard the sickening sound of metal being torn away from the undercarriage. The engine began to labor as the grade increased, and I realized with growing horror that I was climbing toward a dead end. Behind me, the pursuing shapes had multiplied. What had begun as perhaps 3 or 4 individual creatures had become a pack of dozens, all moving with the same inhuman speed and coordination. They made sounds as they ran, howls and yips and calls that echoed off the canyon walls like the voices of the damned. The creature on my roof seemed to sense my growing desperation. It shifted its weight forward and began scratching at the windshield, its claws leaving long gouges in the safety glass. Spider web cracks spread outward from each impact point, reducing my visibility and filling the car with the sound of breaking glass. The road ended abruptly at the edge of a sheer cliff, forcing me to slam on the brakes so hard that the car skidded sideways and nearly went over the precipice. The creature on the roof was thrown forward by the sudden deceleration, its claws leaving deep furrows in the metal as it slid toward the hood. For a moment, I thought it might fall off entirely, but it managed to catch itself and begin climbing back toward the roof. I was trapped. Behind me, the pack of pursuers had closed the distance and now formed a semicircle around the car, their eyes glowing in the darkness like fallen stars. They moved restlessly back and forth, never quite approaching close enough for me to see them clearly, but near enough that I could hear their breathing and smell the sick, sweet odor of decay that surrounded them. The creature on my roof repositioned itself directly above the driver's seat and began pounding on the thin metal with both fists. Each impact sent shock waves through the car's frame and made my teeth rattle in my skull. The roof began to buckle inward, creating a depression that grew larger with each blow. In desperation, I tried to back up, thinking I might be able to ram through the pack behind me. But as soon as I put the car in reverse, they closed ranks, forming a solid wall of bodies that would have crushed me if I'd tried to drive through them. I was completely surrounded, with nowhere to run, and no way to call for help. The windshield finally gave way with a crystalline crash that showered me with pieces of safety glass. The creature's arm thrust through the opening, its impossibly long fingers groping for my face and neck. I leaned back as far as I could, but the car's interior was too small to offer much protection from those reaching claws. That's when I heard the sound of an approaching engine. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a product of terror and desperation. But the sound grew louder and more distinct, the rumble of a heavy truck climbing the rough road I'd just traveled. Headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, growing brighter as they approached. The creatures surrounding my car froze at the sound, their glowing eyes turning toward the approaching vehicle. The thing on my roof stopped its assault and lifted its head, listening intently. For a moment, the entire pack seemed paralyzed by indecision, as if they weren't sure whether to flee or stand their ground. The truck was an old Ford pickup, its paint faded and its body scarred by years of desert use. It moved slowly but steadily up the rocky trail, its driver apparently unconcerned by the rough terrain or the late hour. As it drew closer, I could see that it was driven by another elderly Native American man, this one wearing more modern clothing and a weathered baseball cap. The truck's headlights swept across the pack of creatures, and I watched in amazement as they began to dissolve like smoke in the wind. Their forms became less solid, more transparent, until they were nothing more than shadows that faded into the darkness. The thing on my roof let out a frustrated shriek and leaped away from the car, landing somewhere in the rocks beyond the cliff edge. The truck pulled up beside my car, and the driver rolled down his window. He was perhaps 70 years old, with kind eyes and a face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. Unlike the creature that had tried to lure me away from the road, this man felt completely human and normal. "You okay in there?" he called out. "Saw your lights from the main road and figured someone might be in trouble." I tried to speak, but found that my voice had deserted me. My throat was raw from screaming, and my entire body was shaking with reaction and exhaustion. The old man seemed to understand my condition without explanation. "Follow me," he said simply. "I'll get you back to the highway." He executed a careful three-point turn on the narrow ledge, somehow managing not to go over the cliff despite the limited space. I started my car, which ran perfectly now, as if it had never experienced any mechanical problems, and followed his taillights down the treacherous trail. The descent seemed to take hours, though my watch claimed it was only 30 minutes. We passed landmarks I didn't remember seeing on the way up, as if we were taking a different route entirely. But eventually, we reached the paved surface of Highway 163, and I felt civilization close around me like a warm blanket. The old man pulled over at a small trading post that was still open despite the late hour. A neon sign advertised coffee, gas, and traditional crafts, promising the mundane comforts of the modern world. He got out of his truck and walked over to my window, which I rolled down without hesitation. "You were lucky," he said without preamble. "Most people who go up that road after dark don't come back down." "What were those things?" I asked, finally finding my voice. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the desert darkness behind us. "Old spirits," he said eventually. Angry ones. They've been in these canyons for a long time, since before my grandfather's grandfather. They don't like visitors. He handed me a small bundle of sage tied with red thread. "Burn this when you get home," he instructed. "And don't come back here after sunset. Some places aren't meant for the living, especially at night." I drove straight through to Phoenix without stopping, reaching the city as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. The familiar sights of urban civilization, traffic lights, strip malls, fast food restaurants, had never looked so beautiful. I checked into the first hotel I found and slept for 14 hours straight. But even now, months later, and hundreds of miles from Monument Valley, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night to the sound of tapping on glass. And when I look out my bedroom window, I occasionally see a tall, thin shadow standing just beyond the reach of the streetlights, watching and waiting with infinite patience. The sage bundle sits on my nightstand, partially burned, its sweet smoke offering a small measure of protection against things that shouldn't exist but do. And I've learned to keep my curtains closed after dark, because some shadows are better left unseen, and some sounds are better left unheard. October 15th, 2023. I was 24 years old, and this marked my 6th year joining my best friend Riley on our annual trip to visit his grandparents in the remote mountains of northern Georgia. The small town of Cedar Falls wasn't much more than a collection of weathered buildings scattered along winding mountain roads, but it held a special place in both our hearts. Riley's grandfather, whom we called Pops, was a 73-year-old retired park ranger who had spent his entire life in these mountains. His stories of the wilderness, the changing seasons, and the wildlife that called these peaks home had shaped both Riley and me into the outdoor enthusiasts we'd become. The cabin sat on 12 acres of heavily forested land, surrounded by towering pines and ancient oaks that seemed to whisper secrets when the wind picked up. Every October, we'd make the 4-hour drive from Atlanta, leaving behind the chaos of city life for something more primitive, more real. This year felt different somehow, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Maybe it was the unseasonably warm weather, or perhaps the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer between the trees. But there was an undercurrent of unease that hadn't been there in previous years. Pops had aged noticeably since our last visit. His hands, once steady enough to thread a fishing line in complete darkness, now trembled slightly as he poured his morning coffee. But his eyes remained sharp, constantly scanning the tree line with the practiced awareness of someone who'd spent decades watching for danger in the wilderness. He'd been telling us stories all week about increased drug activity in the area, about hikers finding abandoned camps with suspicious equipment, about the kind of people who use the remote trails for purposes that had nothing to do with enjoying nature. "You boys need to be extra careful out there," he'd warned us repeatedly. "These mountains aren't as safe as they used to be. People are using the deeper trails for things that would make your skin crawl." I've reported 3 separate incidents to the sheriff's department this year alone. Camps with enough chemical residue to suggest serious manufacturing operations, and the kind of people who don't take kindly to unexpected visitors. Riley and I had laughed off his concerns initially, attributing them to the paranoia that sometimes comes with age and isolation. We were young, fit, and familiar with these mountains. What could possibly go wrong during a simple night hike? But as the week progressed, I found myself paying closer attention to Pops's warnings, noticing the way he checked and rechecked the locks on the cabin doors, the way he kept his old hunting rifle closer than usual, and the way he seemed to listen for sounds that weren't quite right. The decision to go on a night hike had been mine. I'd been feeling restless, cooped up in the cabin for days of unseasonably warm weather that made daytime hiking uncomfortable. The October nights had been perfect, cool enough to be comfortable, clear enough to see the stars, and quiet enough to hear the mountains breathe. Riley had been enthusiastic about the idea, and even Pops had agreed to join us, though he'd insisted on bringing equipment that seemed excessive for a simple walk in the woods. Night hiking is different. he'd explained as he packed his old military-grade night vision binoculars. Your senses get heightened, but your visibility gets compromised. You need to be prepared for anything. He'd also insisted we carry extra flashlights, a first aid kit, and his emergency whistle, the kind that could be heard for miles in the mountain stillness. As we prepared for our hike that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Several times throughout the day, I'd caught glimpses of movement in the tree line, just at the edge of my peripheral vision. When I'd looked directly, there was nothing there except the gentle sway of pine branches in the breeze. But the feeling persisted, a crawling sensation between my shoulder blades that made me constantly want to look over my shoulder. The sun had set completely by the time we loaded into Pops's old Ford pickup truck, its headlights cutting through the growing darkness as we made our way down the mountain road toward our chosen trail. The radio crackled with static-filled country music that seemed to fade in and out as we wound through the valleys. I sat in the passenger seat, watching the darkness press in around us, while Riley occupied the space behind me, his excitement infectious despite my growing unease. "Remember the first time we did this?" Riley asked, his voice carrying the kind of nostalgia that comes with shared memories. We were so scared of every little sound, jumping at shadows and convincing ourselves we were hearing things that weren't there. I remembered it well. We'd been 19 then, still young enough to believe that the woods held only the dangers we could see and understand. 5 years of these annual trips had taught us differently. The mountains held secrets, and some of those secrets were darker than others. Pops drove with the practiced ease of someone who knew these roads like the lines on his palm, but I noticed his knuckles were white against the steering wheel. He'd been unusually quiet during dinner, checking his watch frequently and glancing toward the windows as if expecting to see something that shouldn't be there. When I'd asked him about it, he'd simply said that the mountains had been talking differently lately, whatever that meant. The trail we'd chosen was one we'd hiked several times before, a well-maintained path that wound along a creek bed for about 2 miles before opening into a small clearing with a spectacular view of the valley below. It was popular with day hikers and photographers, but rarely used after dark. The parking area was usually empty this time of night, which made the presence of the black Chevrolet SUV all the more unsettling. "Well, that's not right," Pops muttered as our headlights illuminated the vehicle. It was an older model, maybe early 2000s, with tinted windows and enough rust and dents to suggest it had seen better days. More concerning were the 2 figures sitting inside, their faces barely visible in the darkness, but their posture suggesting they were watching us with the same intensity we were watching them. The SUV was parked directly in front of the trail entrance, positioned in a way that seemed intentional rather than coincidental. One of the men, I could see now that they were both middle-aged, both wearing dark clothing, leaned forward as our headlights swept across their windshield. For a moment, we stared at each other across the darkness, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Drug dealers," Pops said matter-of-factly, putting the truck in reverse. "I've seen that vehicle before, usually around the times when the sheriff's department finds those illegal camps I told you about. We're not hiking this trail tonight." As we backed away from the parking area, I watched the SUV in the side mirror. Neither man moved, but I could feel their eyes following us as we retreated down the mountain road. The encounter had lasted less than 30 seconds, but it left me with the distinct impression that we'd narrowly avoided something unpleasant. "There's another trail about half a mile down," Pops explained as we drove away from the first location. "It's not as scenic, but it's got good elevation and decent views. More importantly, it's got multiple entry and exit points, which means we won't be trapped if someone decides to follow us." The second trail was accessed by a narrow dirt road that branched off from the main mountain highway. It was the kind of road that would be easy to miss unless you knew it was there, winding through dense forest before opening into a small clearing where hikers typically parked. Pops drove slowly, his headlights sweeping back and forth across the road surface, checking for fresh tire tracks or other signs of recent activity. "This is better," he said as we pulled into the clearing. We can park here, about 50 feet back from the road, and start our hike from that trailhead over there. He pointed toward a barely visible break in the trees where a worn path disappeared into the darkness. But as we climbed out of the truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't left our problems behind. The encounter with the SUV had left me on edge, and every shadow seemed to hold potential threats. The forest around us was too quiet, missing the usual sounds of nocturnal wildlife that should have been active this time of night. The trail was rougher than I'd expected, winding through dense underbrush that seemed to reach out and grab at our clothing as we passed. Our flashlights carved narrow tunnels of light through the darkness, creating moving shadows that played tricks on our eyes and made every step feel uncertain. Pops led the way with the confident stride of someone who'd walked these mountains for decades, while Riley and I followed close behind, our breathing already becoming labored from the steep incline. The October air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the distant smell of wood smoke from someone's fireplace. Under normal circumstances, it would have been perfect hiking weather. But tonight, every breath felt charged with tension, every sound magnified by the darkness around us. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched. "You boys are jumpy tonight," Pops observed, though his voice carried a note of understanding rather than criticism. "It's natural to be more alert when you can't see more than 10 feet in any direction. Your other senses compensate, pick up things you might miss during the day." He was right. I could hear things I'd never noticed before. The subtle creaking of tree branches, the distant sound of water moving over rocks, the soft rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. But underneath these natural sounds, there was something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We'd been hiking for about 30 minutes when we first heard the dog barking. It was a deep, aggressive sound that carried clearly through the still mountain air, coming from somewhere off to our left, maybe 300 feet away. All three of us stopped simultaneously, our flashlights instinctively sweeping in the direction of the sound. "That's not good," Pops said quietly, his hand moving to the emergency whistle hanging around his neck. "Dogs don't usually bark like that unless they're protecting something or warning someone about intruders." The barking continued, a steady, rhythmic sound that seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains. It was impossible to tell whether the dog was loose or restrained, whether it was alone or with its owner. But there was something unsettling about the persistence of it, the way it seemed to follow us as we continued down the trail. "Should we turn back?" Riley asked, voicing what we were all thinking. His usual enthusiasm had been replaced by a wariness that matched my own growing unease. "Let's give it a few more minutes," Pops decided. "If it doesn't stop, or if it gets closer, we'll head back to the truck. But right now, it sounds like it's staying in one place, which suggests it's probably tied up." We continued hiking, but the barking had changed the entire dynamic of our trip. What had started as a peaceful evening walk had become something more tense, more uncertain. I found myself listening for other sounds. Human voices, the sound of approaching footsteps, anything that might suggest we weren't alone in these mountains. The trail curved sharply to the right, following the contour of the hillside, and for a moment, the barking faded to a distant echo. I allowed myself to relax slightly, thinking perhaps we'd put enough distance between ourselves and whatever was causing the disturbance. But then the sound returned, louder than before, and definitely closer. "That dog is moving," Pop said, stopping abruptly. "And it's coming this way." We stood in silence, listening to the approaching barks. They were getting closer, definitely getting closer, and now I could hear other sounds mixed in. The crash of something large moving through the underbrush, the snap of breaking branches, and underneath it all, what sounded like human voices. "We're leaving," Pops announced, his voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. "Right now." We turned around and began retracing our steps, moving faster than we'd moved on the way up. The barking followed us, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always present. It was like being hunted, tracked by something we couldn't see but could definitely hear. As we hurried back down the trail, I couldn't help but think about Pops's warnings about drug activity in the area. Were we stumbling into something we weren't supposed to see? Had our innocent night hike brought us into contact with people who had reasons to avoid being discovered? The answers to those questions would come soon enough, but not in the way any of us expected. The return journey to the truck felt endless. Every step seemed to take us farther from safety rather than closer to it, and the barking continued to follow us, sometimes echoing from one direction, sometimes from another, as if we were being surrounded. My heart hammered against my ribs as we picked our way down the rocky trail, our flashlights creating wild patterns of light and shadow that made it impossible to judge distances or identify potential threats. Pops had taken the lead, his 73-year-old body moving with surprising agility over the rough terrain. Years of hiking these mountains had left him with an instinctive understanding of how to navigate in the dark, where to place his feet to avoid loose rocks, which branches to duck under, and how to read the subtle changes in the trail surface that indicated obstacles ahead. "Almost there," he called back to us, his voice barely carrying over the sound of our labored breathing. "Another few hundred yards and we'll be back at the truck." But as we rounded the final curve in the trail, the beam of my flashlight caught something that made my blood freeze in my veins. There, parked directly behind Pop's truck, was a vehicle with its headlights on and its engine running. Even from a distance of nearly 1,000 feet, I could tell it was the same black SUV we'd encountered at the first trail. "Stop!" Pops hissed, grabbing both Riley and me by the arm. "Get down and turn off your flashlights." We crouched behind a large boulder beside the trail, plunging ourselves into complete darkness. The sudden transition from light to dark left me temporarily blind, but my other senses immediately sharpened. I could hear the distant rumble of the SUV's engine, the continued barking of the dog somewhere in the forest behind us, and the rapid, shallow breathing of my companions. "How did they know we were here?" Riley whispered, his voice barely audible. "They followed us," Pops replied grimly. "Or they had someone watching the road, waiting to see where we went after we left the first trail. Either way, we're in trouble." The implications of our situation began to sink in. We were trapped on a remote mountain trail, surrounded by people who clearly didn't want us there, with no way to reach our vehicle and no cell phone coverage to call for help. The darkness that had seemed like a minor inconvenience now felt like a prison, hiding dangers we couldn't see or prepare for. "What do we do?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded despite the terror coursing through my system. "We wait," Pop said, "and we watch. Maybe they'll get bored and leave." But even as he spoke, I could tell he didn't believe it. There was something deliberate about the way they'd positioned themselves, something that suggested they were prepared to wait us out. They knew we had to come back eventually, and they were patient enough to wait for us to make the first move. Through the darkness, I could make out the faint glow of the SUV's headlights illuminating the area around our truck. The vehicle was positioned at an angle that would allow its occupants to see anyone approaching from the trail, but also provided them with a quick escape route if necessary. It was the kind of tactical positioning that suggested these weren't amateurs. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness. The barking behind us had stopped, but somehow that felt more ominous than when it had been constant. Had they called off their dog? Were they moving into position around us? Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every sound carried the possibility of discovery. Then, to my absolute horror, the SUV began to move. Instead of backing up and leaving as we'd hoped, it drove around our truck and started heading directly toward us down the trail. The headlights swept back and forth across the narrow dirt road, searching for signs of our presence. "Move!" Pops commanded, his voice urgent but still controlled. "Up the hill behind that fallen log." We scrambled up the steep slope to our right, our hands and feet finding purchase on roots and rocks as we climbed. The log Pops had spotted was massive, probably an old oak that had fallen during a storm, and it provided perfect concealment from anyone on the trail below. We threw ourselves behind it just as the SUV's headlights swept across our former position. From our hiding spot, we had a clear view of the trail below. The SUV moved slowly, its windows down, and I could see the silhouettes of at least 2 people inside. They were scanning the forest methodically, their heads turning back and forth as they searched for any sign of movement. The SUV crept down the trail with predatory patience, its headlights sweeping from side to side like the eyes of some massive nocturnal predator. From our position behind the fallen log, we could see everything: the deliberate way they were searching, the way they paused at every potential hiding spot, the way they seemed to be communicating with each other through gestures and whispered words that didn't carry up to our position. My body was pressed against the rough bark of the log, every muscle tense with the effort of remaining perfectly still. A single cough, a shifted position, even the wrong kind of breathing could give us away. The October air, which had felt comfortable during our hike, now seemed to bite at my exposed skin as adrenaline made me hyper-aware of every sensation. Pops lay between Riley and me, his military training evident in the way he'd positioned himself to watch the threat below while keeping us protected. His weathered hands gripped the night vision binoculars, though he didn't dare raise them to his eyes while the SUV's headlights might catch the reflection of the lenses. Instead, he watched with the naked eye, his decades of experience in these mountains giving him an advantage over the hunters below. "They're looking for tracks," he whispered, his voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "See how they're stopping at every muddy spot? They're trying to figure out how far up the trail we went." The SUV paused about 50 feet below our position, and I could hear the engine idle drop as they shifted into park. Car doors opened with the distinctive creak of old hinges, and I watched in growing terror as 2 figures emerged from the vehicle. They were both wearing dark clothing and baseball caps, their faces hidden in shadow, but their movements spoke of people who were comfortable operating in the darkness. One of them carried a powerful flashlight, the kind used by law enforcement or military personnel, while the other held what looked like a radio or cell phone. They began walking slowly along the trail, their lights sweeping back and forth across the ground, clearly following some kind of trail sign that we'd inadvertently left behind. "Tracks," Pops mouthed silently, pointing toward the muddy section of trail where we'd walked earlier. Even from our elevated position, I could see the clear impressions our boots had left in the soft earth. The 2 men followed our tracks with the methodical precision of experienced trackers. They moved slowly, carefully, stopping frequently to examine the ground or confer with each other in voices too low for us to hear. But their body language was clear. They were getting closer to finding us. As they approached the spot where we'd left the trail to climb up the hillside, I felt my heart rate spike to levels that made my vision blur around the edges. The muddy area where we'd scrambled up the slope would show clear signs of disturbance, and from there, it would be a simple matter to follow our path to the fallen log. "When they find our tracks going up the hill," Pops whispered, his voice barely audible, "we move. Quietly, but quickly. There's another trail about 100 yards that way." He pointed deeper into the forest, away from our current position. The man with the flashlight reached the base of our hill and immediately stopped. His light swept across the disturbed earth where we'd climbed, and I could see him gesture to his companion. They'd found our escape route. "Now," Pops breathed. We began moving, staying low and trying to step only on solid ground that wouldn't show our passage. The fallen log had been our salvation, but now it was about to become our prison if we didn't move quickly enough. Behind us, I could hear the 2 men beginning their own climb up the hillside, their progress marked by the snap of breaking branches and the soft thud of boots on earth. The forest around us was a maze of trees, rocks, and underbrush, that seemed designed to trip us up and slow our progress. Without flashlights, we were moving almost entirely by feel, our hands extended in front of us to avoid walking into trees, our feet testing each step before committing our full weight. But our pursuers had no such limitations. Their flashlights cut through the darkness like swords, and I could see the beams getting closer to our position. They were moving faster than we were, more confident in their ability to navigate the terrain, and they clearly had experience in this kind of pursuit. "The trail?" Pops gasped, pointing toward a break in the trees that I couldn't see but had to trust was there. 50 more yards. Those 50 yards felt like 50 miles. Every step was a gamble, every breath a risk of discovery. The flashlight beams were getting closer, and I could hear voices now. Not words, but the tone and cadence of people coordinating a search. The secondary trail Pops had mentioned was little more than a deer path, barely wide enough for single file and carpeted with fallen leaves that rustled with every step. In daylight, it would have been challenging to follow. In the darkness, with adrenaline making our movements clumsy and fear making every shadow seem like a threat, it was nearly impossible. We stumbled through the underbrush like drunken men, our hands constantly extended to feel for obstacles, our feet testing each step before committing our weight. Behind us, the pursuit continued, marked by the sweep of flashlight beams and the occasional crack of branches as our hunters made their way through the forest. "They're not giving up," Riley whispered, his voice tight with exhaustion and fear. We'd been moving for what felt like hours, though it had probably been less than 30 minutes. The physical exertion of climbing through rough terrain in complete darkness was taking its toll on all of us. Pops paused ahead of us, his hand raised in a gesture for silence. We froze, listening to the sounds of the night around us. The forest had gone quiet. Even the usual sounds of nocturnal wildlife had been stilled by the presence of too many humans moving through their territory. "There!" Pops pointed toward a faint glow visible through the trees. "That's the main road. If we can get there, we can flag down help." But as we watched, the glow began to move. It wasn't stationary lighting from the road. It was the headlights of a vehicle, moving slowly along the mountain highway. And as it drew closer, I could see that it was searching, its headlights sweeping back and forth across the forest edge just as the SUV had done on the trail. They have more people, I realized with growing horror. They're not just following us on foot, they have someone watching the road. The implications were terrifying. We weren't dealing with opportunistic criminals who had stumbled across our presence. This was coordinated, planned, and executed with a level of organization that suggested serious criminal activity. We had walked into something much bigger and more dangerous than a simple drug operation. "How many of them are there?" Riley asked, voicing what we were all thinking. "Doesn't matter," Pops replied grimly. "We need to find another way out." But our options were rapidly disappearing. The terrain around us was becoming increasingly difficult. Steep slopes covered with loose rocks that would create noise with every step, dense thickets that would slow our progress to a crawl, and areas of exposed rock that would leave clear tracks for our pursuers to follow. The vehicle on the road had stopped directly opposite our position, its headlights now stationary and pointed into the forest. I could see figures moving around the vehicle, and what looked like the distinctive outline of someone setting up some kind of equipment. "Night vision," Pop said, recognizing what I was seeing. "They're setting up night vision equipment to scan the forest." The technology gap between us and our pursuers was becoming apparent. We had 3 small flashlights that we couldn't use without giving away our position, while they had powerful searchlights, night vision equipment, and multiple vehicles. It was like being hunted by a military unit while armed with nothing but our wits and our knowledge of the terrain. "There's a creek about half a mile that way." Pops pointed toward what looked like impenetrable darkness. "If we can get there, we can follow it downstream. Water won't hold our tracks, and the sound of moving water will mask our movement." Half a mile had never sounded so far. The terrain between us and the creek was some of the roughest in the area. Steep slopes, thick underbrush, and multiple rocky outcroppings that would be treacherous to navigate in daylight, let alone in complete darkness while being pursued by people with superior equipment and numbers. But we had no choice. The alternative was to remain in place and hope our pursuers would give up, which seemed increasingly unlikely given the resources they were putting into finding us. Or we could try to surrender, but given what we'd stumbled into, that seemed like an option that would end badly for all of us. "Stay close," Pops instructed. "And whatever happens, don't make any noise. They're listening for us now." We began moving again, this time with even more caution than before. Every step was calculated, every breath controlled. The darkness around us was complete, forcing us to rely on senses that felt inadequate for the task at hand. Behind us, the search continued. I could hear voices calling to each other, the sound of vehicles moving along the road, and the occasional crack of someone moving through the underbrush. They were methodical, professional, and persistent, and they were getting closer. The sound of running water reached us before we could see the creek, a gentle babbling that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence of our flight. After what felt like hours of stumbling through the darkness, the promise of the creek represented both hope and terror. Hope because it offered a way to move without leaving tracks. Terror because reaching it meant crossing exposed ground where we would be vulnerable to the night vision equipment our pursuers were using. The creek was smaller than I'd expected, perhaps 3 feet wide and maybe a foot deep, running over smooth stones that had been polished by decades of mountain runoff. Under different circumstances, it would have been a peaceful spot, the kind of place where you might stop during a day hike to rest and enjoy the sounds of nature. Tonight, it represented our only chance of escape. "Get in the water," Pops instructed, his voice barely audible over the sound of the current. "Walk in the center, try not to splash. The water will hide our scent from any dogs they might bring in." The water was shockingly cold, even through our hiking boots. October mountain water carries the bite of approaching winter, and within seconds, my feet began to go numb. But the discomfort was nothing compared to the relief of knowing we were leaving no tracks for our pursuers to follow. We moved downstream in single file, Pops leading the way with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had spent his life in these mountains. The creek bed was treacherous, loose stones that shifted underfoot, sudden drops that could send you tumbling, and overhanging branches that seemed to reach out from the darkness to grab at our clothing. "This creek connects to the main river about 2 miles downstream," Pops explained in a whisper. "There's a bridge there, and a road that leads back to town. If we can make it that far, we can get help." 2 miles had never sounded so far. Every step was a battle against the current, the cold, and the darkness. My feet were completely numb now, and I could feel the beginning of hypothermia creeping into my legs. But behind us, the search continued, and the alternative to pressing on was unthinkable. As we followed the creek downstream, pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The organized nature of our pursuit, the multiple vehicles, the professional equipment. This wasn't random criminal activity. We had stumbled into something much bigger, much more dangerous. "Pops," I whispered during a brief stop to rest. "What do you think they're doing out here?" His face was grim in the faint starlight. "I think we found one of those manufacturing operations I've been reporting to the sheriff, and I think they're willing to do whatever it takes to protect it." The implications were chilling. We weren't just dealing with drug dealers or petty criminals. We were dealing with people who had invested serious resources in their operation, people who had too much to lose to let witnesses walk away. "The dog we heard earlier," Riley said suddenly. "It wasn't just barking at us. It was alerting them to our presence." That made sense. The persistent barking, the way it had seemed to follow us, the way it had stopped just before the SUV appeared. It had all been coordinated. We had walked into a trap that had been set long before we'd even decided to go hiking. They've been watching the trails, Pops realized, probably for weeks or months. Anyone who gets too close to their operation becomes a target. The creek curved sharply to the left, following the natural contours of the mountain. As we rounded the bend, I could see lights in the distance, not the searching beams of our pursuers, but the steady glow of civilization. Streetlights, house lights, the blessed promise of safety and help. The bridge. Pops pointed toward a structure barely visible in the darkness. We're almost there. But as we approached the bridge, I could see that our ordeal wasn't over. Parked at the near end of the bridge was another vehicle. This one with its headlights off, but its engine running. Someone was waiting for us. They anticipated this, Pops said grimly. They knew about the creek, knew where it led. They've been herding us toward this point. We were trapped again, caught between the pursuers behind us and the trap ahead. The creek that had seemed like our salvation now felt like a channel leading us directly into the hands of people who wished us harm. "What do we do now?" Riley asked, his voice carrying the exhaustion and fear we all felt. Pops was quiet for a long moment, weighing our options. Behind us, I could hear the sound of our pursuers getting closer, their search moving systematically down the mountainside toward the creek. Ahead of us, the bridge represented both escape and capture. "We have one advantage," he said finally. "They don't know exactly where we are. They're covering the most obvious exit point, but they can't watch everywhere." He pointed toward the far bank of the creek, where the terrain looked even more challenging than what we'd already crossed. "There's another trail over there, one that most people don't know about. It's steep and rough, but it leads to a different road, one they might not be watching." The decision to cross the creek and attempt the unknown trail felt like stepping off a cliff into an abyss. We were abandoning the familiar for the unknown, trading a difficult but manageable path for one that might prove impossible in our exhausted state. But as the lights of our pursuers grew closer and the trap at the bridge became more apparent, we had no choice but to take the gamble. The crossing was the most terrifying part of our entire ordeal. The creek was deeper here, reaching nearly to our knees, and the current was stronger as it approached the main river. Worse, we had to cross in the open, exposed to anyone watching from either direction. For 30 seconds, we would be completely vulnerable. "One at a time," Pops instructed. "I'll go first, then Riley, then you. If anyone gets spotted, the other two keep going no matter what." I watched Pops wade into the deeper water, his 73-year-old body moving with the careful precision of someone who knew that a single misstep could mean death. The current tugged at his legs, and I could see the effort it took for him to maintain his balance on the slippery stones of the creek bed. He made it across and immediately disappeared into the shadows of the far bank. Riley followed, younger and stronger but less experienced in reading the treacherous footing. I held my breath as he navigated the deepest part of the crossing, where the water reached nearly to his waist. Then it was my turn. The water was shockingly cold, even after the numbing effect of walking in the creek for over an hour. The current was stronger than I'd expected, and the stones beneath my feet were covered with a slippery coating that made every step uncertain. Halfway across, I felt my right foot slip on a loose rock, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I was going to fall. But I managed to regain my balance and push forward, reaching the far bank just as I heard the sound of voices from the direction we'd come. Our pursuers had reached the creek and were beginning to follow our trail downstream. "Here," Pops whispered, pointing toward what looked like a solid wall of vegetation. "The trail starts behind those bushes." What he called a trail was almost invisible, a gap between trees that might have been created by deer or other wildlife, barely wide enough for a single person. It led upward at a steep angle, disappearing into the darkness of the forest canopy. "This is going to be rough," he warned. It's about a mile straight up, and then another mile along the ridge before it connects to the old logging road. But it's our only chance. We began climbing immediately, knowing that every second we delayed gave our pursuers more time to organize their search. The trail was everything Pops had warned and worse, steep enough to require the use of hands as well as feet, rocky enough to be treacherous in the dark, and overgrown enough to tear at our clothing and scratch our exposed skin. Behind us, I could hear the sound of our pursuers discovering our crossing point. Voices called out coordinates, engines revved as vehicles moved to new positions, and the systematic search began again. But this time, we had a head start and the advantage of knowing where we were going. The climb was brutal. My legs, already exhausted from hours of hiking and wading through cold water, screamed in protest with every step. My lungs burned from the effort of breathing in the thin mountain air, and my hands were torn and bleeding from grabbing at rocks and tree roots for support. But fear is a powerful motivator, and the knowledge that capture might mean death kept us moving even when our bodies wanted to stop. We climbed in silence, saving our breath for the physical effort, communicating only through gestures and the occasional whispered warning about obstacles ahead. After what felt like an eternity, the trail began to level out. We had reached the ridge, and through the trees, I could see the lights of the valley spread out below us. Somewhere down there was civilization, safety, and help. But we still had to get there. The logging road is just ahead, Pops gasped, his voice showing the strain of the climb. Once we reach it, it's all downhill to the main highway. The logging road was a blessed relief, wide enough for vehicles, smooth enough for relatively easy walking, and familiar enough that we could move with more confidence. We began jogging despite our exhaustion, knowing that we were racing against time and the organizational abilities of our pursuers. As we rounded a curve in the road, I saw the most beautiful sight of my life, the headlights of a sheriff's department patrol car moving slowly up the road toward us. Pops pulled out his emergency whistle and began blowing it in the pattern that indicated distress, the sound echoing off the mountains around us. The patrol car stopped, and I could see the officer inside speaking rapidly into his radio. Within minutes, the quiet mountain road was filled with the lights and sounds of law enforcement vehicles, paramedics, and search and rescue teams. "We found something," one of the deputies reported after taking our statement. "A major methamphetamine manufacturing operation about 2 miles from where you started your hike. We've arrested 6 people so far, and we found enough equipment and chemicals to supply half the state. We had stumbled into something much bigger than a simple drug operation. We had discovered a criminal enterprise that had been operating in the mountains for months, using the remote trails to transport supplies and finished products while staying hidden from law enforcement. You boys are lucky to be alive," the sheriff told us as paramedics checked us for injuries. "These people have been responsible for at least 3 disappearances in the area over the past year. People who got too close to their operation and were never seen again." As we sat in the back of the ambulance, warming ourselves with emergency blankets and hot coffee, I couldn't help but think about how close we'd come to becoming statistics ourselves. A few wrong decisions, a little less luck, a little less knowledge of the terrain, and we would have joined the ranks of people who had ventured into the mountains and never returned. The mountains of northern Georgia are beautiful, peaceful, and full of opportunities for outdoor recreation. But they also hold secrets, and some of those secrets are darker than others. Our annual hiking trip had taught us that the wilderness can be dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with wildlife or weather, and that sometimes the greatest threat in the mountains walks on 2 legs and carries a flashlight. We never did finish that night hike. But we lived to tell the story, and sometimes that's the best ending you can hope for. My name is Ethan Hargrove, and this happened to me on June 12, 1998. I'm a truck driver, or I was back then, hauling freight across the country for almost 15 years. The cab of my Peterbilt had been more of a home to me than any apartment I'd rented. I'd seen this country from every angle, in all kinds of weather, at all hours of the day and night. I thought I knew the road and its unspoken rules. I thought I understood the rhythm of America's highways and the people who traveled them. I was wrong. That morning started like any other. I'd picked up a load of auto parts in Salt Lake City, bound for a dealership in Casper, Wyoming. The manifest listed everything from transmissions to windshield wipers. Nothing unusual. The dispatcher had given me a tight timeline, but I was making good progress despite the punishing June heat that had the asphalt shimming like black water in the distance. By mid-afternoon, I was deep into Wyoming on Route 287. If you've never driven through that part of the country, it's hard to describe just how empty it is. Miles of sagebrush and dirt, broken only by the occasional fence line or distant butte. The kind of emptiness that makes a man aware of his own heartbeat. The radio reception had faded to static an hour back, and I was humming to myself when I first heard it. A metallic shriek from somewhere under the hood, followed by a series of sharp knocks. No, 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 I muttered, easing off the accelerator. The engine temperature gauge was creeping into the red. I nursed the rig to the shoulder, the wheels crunching on gravel as I brought 18 tons of steel to a halt. When I cut the engine, the silence was immediate and complete. No passing cars, no distant tractors, just the tick of cooling metal and the whisper of wind through scrub grass. I popped the hood and was greeted by a blast of steam. Once it cleared, I didn't need my 15 years of experience to know I was in trouble. The alternator was shot, and there were signs the radiator was cracked as well. This wasn't a quick fix. I climbed back into the cab and called dispatch on my company phone. The connection was terrible, all crackles and dropped words, but I managed to report my position and situation. "Send a tow," the dispatcher's voice fragmented. "Might be a few hours." "How many hours?" I asked, but the line went dead. I tried again, but couldn't get through. Just my luck. I checked my watch, 3:27 p.m. The sun was still high, but out here with no shelter, that was more threat than comfort. I took stock of my supplies, half a gallon of water, some beef jerky, a couple of candy bars, enough to wait it out, but not comfortably. I decided to stretch my legs and popped open the door. The heat hit me like a physical force, the kind that seems to suck the moisture right out of your eyeballs. I walked around the truck, checking tires out of habit, then found a flat rock about 20 yards away and sat down, facing the road. Hours passed. The sun began its descent, turning the landscape golden, then amber. I checked my watch compulsively. 5:45 p.m. 6:30 p.m., 7:15 p.m. Still no sign of a tow truck or highway patrol. My water was running low, and a dull headache had begun to throb behind my eyes. When I finally heard an engine, the sun was just kissing the horizon. I stood up, waving my arms, expecting the tow truck. Instead, a battered blue Ford pickup slowed and pulled onto the shoulder ahead of my rig. The truck was at least 20 years old. Its paint job faded to a ghostly shade that might once have been navy. Rust had eaten away at the wheel wells, and the back bumper was secured with what looked like baling wire. The driver's door creaked open, and a man stepped out. From a distance, he seemed ordinary enough. Medium height, wiry build, dressed in the standard uniform of rural America. Faded jeans, flannel shirt despite the heat, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. As he approached, though, I noticed details that set off faint alarm bells in my mind. His jeans were stained with something dark around the knees. His flannel was buttoned unevenly, and there was something about his walk, a slight limp that seemed to vanish and reappear with each step, as if he was remembering and then forgetting to perform it. "Having trouble?" he called out, his voice surprisingly soft for a man of his rough appearance. "Alternators shot," I replied, waiting on a tow. He was close enough now that I could see his face beneath the cap. Weathered skin, deep wrinkles around pale blue eyes, 3 days' worth of salt and pepper stubble. His teeth, when he smiled, were surprisingly white and even. "Name's Roy," he said, extending a hand. His palm was calloused but cold despite the heat. "Been waiting long?" "Few hours. Dispatch said they'd send someone." Roy chuckled, a dry sound like dead leaves scraping across pavement. "Dispatch always says that. You'll be lucky if they show before morning. Town's just 15 miles up the road. I could give you a lift, get some food in you while you wait." I hesitated. The company policy was clear: never abandon your load. But the sun was nearly gone now, and with it would go the heat. Wyoming nights can be bitter, even in June. And 15 miles wasn't far. I could be back here when the tow arrived. "That's mighty kind of you," I said finally. "Let me just lock up." As I secured the truck, I caught Roy watching me, his head tilted slightly to one side, that odd smile still fixed on his face. For a moment, just a moment, I considered declining his offer. But then he was opening the passenger door of his pickup, gesturing me in with a sweeping motion that seemed almost theatrical. "After you, Mr. Truck Driver," he said. "Let's get you somewhere civilized." I had no idea then that his definition of civilized would prove to be very different from my own. The inside of Roy's pickup smelled like a cocktail of motor oil, cigarette smoke, and something earthy that I couldn't quite place. Animal musk, maybe, or old sweat. The bench seat was covered in a Mexican blanket riddled with cigarette burns, and the dashboard was home to a collection of faded plastic figurines, mostly cowboys and Indians, their paint chipped away by years of sun exposure. "So," Roy said as we pulled back onto the empty highway, "what brings you out to this stretch of nowhere?" I explained about my delivery, the tight schedule, the breakdown. Roy nodded along, occasionally making soft humming noises that might have been acknowledgement or just a habit. His driving was oddly precise for someone who seemed so disheveled. Hands at 10 and 2, eyes scanning the road continuously. "You live around here?" I asked during a lull in our conversation. "Got a place up in the hills," he replied, gesturing vaguely to the west. "Nothing fancy, but it's mine. Do some hunting, odd jobs here and there. Keep to myself mostly. Must get lonely." Roy turned to look at me then, his pale eyes reflecting the last crimson glow of sunset. "Lonely? Nah. People are overrated, don't you think? Always wanting something, always talking but never saying much." He smiled. "Besides, I'm not always alone." Something in his tone made me glance at the rear window, half expecting to see someone crouched in the truck bed. There was nothing but dusk and dust. The road stretched ahead, a black ribbon against the darkening landscape. We passed no other vehicles, no houses, not even a fence line. Just endless emptiness. I found myself checking my watch again, 7:45 p.m. The tow truck might already be at my rig, finding it abandoned. "How much further?" I asked. "Getting anxious?" Roy chuckled. "Not much now. Leland's just over that rise." I'd never heard of a town called Leland in Wyoming, but that wasn't unusual. Plenty of tiny settlements dotted these back highways, places too small to appear on most maps, places where strangers were noticed. As we crested the hill, I saw it. A cluster of buildings huddled against the growing darkness like animals seeking warmth from each other. No more than a dozen structures lined the main street with a few outlying houses scattered at the edges. Only 3 buildings showed any lights. What looked like a diner, a gas station, and what might have been a bar. "Not much to look at," Roy admitted as we rolled down the main street. "But it's home to some." The town had an abandoned feel, like something left behind by the tide of progress. Several storefronts were boarded up, and those that weren't looked tired and worn. The gas station's price sign advertised unleaded at 98 cents, probably hadn't been updated in years. No people walked the sidewalks, no cars parked along the curbs. The only sign of life was a flickering neon open sign in the diner window. Roy pulled into a space directly in front of it. "Best place in town," he said. "Only place in town, really, unless you count Daryl's bar, and believe me, you don't want to eat there." The diner was a classic American stereotype. Red vinyl booths, chrome-edged tables, a long counter with swiveling stools. A bell jingled as we entered, but the place was nearly empty. An elderly couple occupied a booth near the back, heads bent over mugs of coffee. A solitary man sat at the counter. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a shaved head and a neck thick as a tree trunk. He turned slightly at our entrance, his eyes narrowing as they swept over me. "That's Mitch," Roy muttered. "Town odd job, man. Bit simple but harmless." The waitress emerged from a swinging door behind the counter. She was maybe 40, with faded blonde hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail and eyes that had seen too much of something. Her name tag read Claire. "Evening, Roy," she said, her voice neutral. "Usual?" "And whatever my friend here wants," Roy replied. "This is Ethan. His rig broke down out on 287. Claire's eyes flicked to me, something unreadable passing across her face. "That's tough luck. Payphone's out back if you need to make a call." We settled into a booth and I ordered a burger and coffee. The phone could wait until after I'd eaten. My stomach was growling audibly by now. "Claire makes the best burgers in 3 counties, Roy said, tapping his fingers on the table in an irregular rhythm. "Uses fresh beef from her brother's ranch. None of that frozen patty nonsense." I nodded, watching as Claire moved behind the counter, occasionally glancing our way. The man called Mitch was watching her too, his massive shoulders hunched over a plate of something I couldn't identify. The elderly couple paid their bill and left, the bell jingling behind them. The diner felt even emptier with their departure. "Small place," I observed. "Everyone must know everyone." "Oh, yes," Roy agreed. "And their business. That's the thing about small towns. No secrets last long." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Except the ones everyone agrees to keep." Before I could ask what he meant, Claire arrived with our food. My burger was massive, the meat juicy and pink in the middle, just the way I liked it. Roy had ordered some kind of meatloaf that he attacked with surprising delicacy, cutting it into precise squares before eating. "So," I said between bites, "is there a motel around here? Somewhere I can crash until my truck gets fixed?" Roy and Claire exchanged a quick glance that I almost missed. "Motel closed down 3 years back," Claire said. "Nearest one's in Rollins, about 40 miles south." "I've got a spare room," Roy offered. "Nothing fancy, but the bed's clean. You're welcome to it for the night." I hesitated, my burger halfway to my mouth. The offer made sense. I was stranded after all. But something about the way Claire's eyes widened slightly made me pause. "That's real kind of you," I said carefully. "But I should probably wait here for that tow. Make sure they find my rig." Roy shrugged, returning to his methodical consumption of meatloaf. "Suit yourself. Diner closes at 9, though. Claire's got her own life to get back to." He checked his watch. "That gives you about 45 minutes. I finished my burger in thoughtful silence. Roy kept checking his watch, which struck me as odd for a man who had just described himself as someone with nowhere to be. Mitch remained at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee that he hadn't touched in the 15 minutes we'd been there. When Roy excused himself to use the restroom, Mitch moved with surprising speed for a man his size. He slid onto the seat Roy had vacated, his pale gray eyes fixed on mine. "Don't go with him," he said, his voice a rumbling whisper. "What?" "Roy, don't go to his place. Something ain't right with him." "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning forward. Mitch glanced toward the restroom door. "People go missing around here. Truckers, mostly. Hitchhikers. Nobody important enough for the cops to look hard." His eyes darted nervously. Last guy who broke down. His truck got towed, but he never claimed it. The bathroom door opened, and Mitch stood quickly, moving back to his stool at the counter. Roy returned, smiling pleasantly, apparently oblivious to our brief conversation. "All set?" he asked. "I should probably get you back to your truck. Tow might be there by now." I nodded, suddenly eager to be back on the highway, even if it meant spending the night in my cab. We paid the bill, Roy insisting on covering mine, and headed for the door. As we left, I glanced back. Mitch was watching us, his face expressionless. Claire stood beside him, whispering something in his ear. The night air was cool now, a sharp contrast to the day's heat. The street was dark, except for the pools of light beneath the few functioning street lamps. Roy's truck waited by the curb, its blue paint almost black in the darkness. "Hop in," he said cheerfully. "Let's get you back to civilization." As I reached for the door handle, I caught a glimpse of movement across the street. A shadow detached itself from the alley between two buildings and moved quickly down the sidewalk, paralleling our path. For a moment, I thought it was Mitch, but this figure was smaller, more agile. "Something wrong?" Roy asked, noticing my hesitation. "No," I lied, climbing into the pickup. "Just thought I saw something." Roy's smile in the dim light of the cab was oddly tight. "Lots of shadows out here at night. Tricks the eye." As we pulled away from the curb, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, and followed. We drove in silence, the pickup's headlights carving a tunnel through the darkness. Roy had turned on the radio, but all it produced was static, punctuated occasionally by fragments of country music or evangelical preaching. After a few minutes, he switched it off with a sigh. "Reception's always bad out here," he explained. "Something about the hills." I nodded, watching the road. We should have been heading back toward my truck on Route 287, but the surroundings didn't look familiar. We'd turned off the main street of Leland onto a narrow county road, and now we were climbing into the foothills, the truck's engine straining against the incline. "This doesn't seem like the way back to my rig," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. Roy's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "Taking a shortcut. Back roads will get us there quicker than going around." It didn't make sense. Shortcuts through hills are rarely faster than the straight shot of a highway, but I didn't argue. Instead, I studied our surroundings, mentally mapping each turn. If I needed to find my way back on foot, I wanted to remember the route. The road narrowed further, becoming little more than a dirt track. Pine trees crowded close on either side, their branches occasionally scraping against the truck's roof. We hadn't passed another vehicle since leaving town, and I hadn't seen a house or power line for at least 10 minutes. "You live out this way?" I asked. Roy nodded. "Just up ahead. Thought we'd stop by, get you something stronger than coffee for the wait. Nights get cold, even in June." Before I could object, he turned onto an even smaller track, barely visible among the trees. The truck bounced and lurched over ruts, forcing me to brace against the dashboard. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only 5 minutes, we emerged into a small clearing. Roy's cabin was more substantial than I'd expected, a solid structure of logs and stone, with a metal roof that gleamed dully in the moonlight. A generator hummed somewhere behind it, and yellow light spilled from the windows. A workshop or shed stood to one side, its doors secured with a heavy padlock. Beyond the buildings, the forest pressed close, dark and dense. "Home, sweet home," Roy said, cutting the engine. I hesitated. Mitch's warning echoed in my mind, along with a growing catalog of oddities. Roy's inconsistent limp, his excessive watch-checking, the strange glances between him and Claire, the route that took us deeper into isolation rather than back to the highway. "Actually," I began, "I should really get back to my truck. The tow—" "Won't be there yet," Roy interrupted smoothly. "Trust me, I know how these things work out here. We're talking hours, not minutes. Come in, have a drink, warm up a bit, Then I'll take you back. Scout's honor. He held up 3 fingers in what might have been a scout salute. The alternative was to demand he take me back immediately, potentially angering a man who knew these woods and had me at a distinct disadvantage. Or I could play along, look for an opportunity to use a phone or slip away. All right, I agreed. Just one drink, then back to the road. Roy's cabin was a single large room with a loft above. A wood stove dominated one wall, though it wasn't lit. The furnishings were simple but sturdy. A table and chairs made from rough-hewn logs, a sofa covered in faded plaid, mismatched cabinets that might have been salvaged from renovation projects, hunting rifles hung on one wall, alongside mounted deer heads and what looked like a bobcat, frozen in a permanent snarl. "Make yourself comfortable," Roy said, gesturing to the sofa. "Beer? Whiskey?" "Beer's fine," I replied, noticing there was no phone visible in the room. Roy disappeared into what I assumed was a kitchen area, separated from the main room by a curtain of wooden beads. I took the opportunity to scan the cabin more thoroughly. A stack of magazines sat on a side table. Hunting, fishing, automotive. Normal enough. But beside them lay a pile of truckers' wallets, at least 5 or 6, their leather worn and edges frayed. My heart rate kicked up a notch. There could be innocent explanations. Maybe Roy collected them or found them abandoned. Maybe he was a trucker himself once. But combined with Mitch's warning about missing drivers, they took on a more ominous significance. Roy returned with 2 beers, the caps already removed. He handed one to me and took a long pull from his own. "Cheers," he said. "To unexpected company." I pretended to drink, letting just enough liquid past my lips to be convincing. The beer could be drugged, or it might be perfectly fine. I wasn't willing to take the chance. Roy settled into an armchair across from me, his pale eyes never leaving my face. "So, 15 years on the road. Must have seen some interesting things." I nodded, launching into a series of sanitized road stories. Funny breakdowns, unusual cargo, strange hitchhikers. All the while, I was assessing the cabin, looking for weapons, escape routes, anything useful. The front door was the obvious exit, but there had to be a back way as well. The windows were small but not impassable. As I talked, Roy's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He would lean forward, intensely focused on my words, then abruptly check his watch or glance toward the windows. His right leg bounced continuously, an anxious tic that belied his relaxed posture. Twice he got up to peer through the curtains, as if expecting someone. "Waiting for someone?" I finally asked. Roy's smile tightened. "Just jumpy, I guess. Don't get visitors much." He checked his watch again. "Getting late. Maybe you should stay the night after all. I can make up the cot in the loft." "That's real kind," I said, forcing a smile. "But I really should get back. Company policy, never abandon your load." "Your load's not going anywhere," Roy countered, a new edge to his voice. "And neither is your truck. Roads aren't safe at night. All sorts of things wander out of these hills after dark." The threat was thinly veiled, but before I could respond, a sound from outside caught both our attention. The crunch of tires on gravel, a car door slamming. Roy stood abruptly. "Excuse me," he said, his voice tight. "Got to check on something." He grabbed a jacket from a hook by the door and stepped outside, pulling it shut behind him. Immediately I moved to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain. In the moonlight, I could see Roy striding toward a vehicle parked at the edge of the clearing. Not his blue pickup, but a newer model SUV, dark in color. A figure stood beside it, gesticulating angrily. Even from a distance, I recognized the massive shoulders and shaved head of Mitch from the diner. The 2 men were arguing, their voices rising and falling, but never quite loud enough for me to make out words. Mitch pointed repeatedly toward the cabin, toward me, while Roy shook his head emphatically. At one point, Roy shoved Mitch backward, a move that seemed suicidal given the size difference between them, but Mitch merely stumbled and continued arguing. This was my chance. I abandoned the window and moved quickly through the cabin, looking for a back door. I found it off the kitchen area, secured with a simple deadbolt. I eased it open, wincing at the slight creak of the hinges, and stepped out into the cold night air. The forest loomed just 20 yards away, dark and dense, offering concealment but also countless hazards for someone unfamiliar with the terrain. Still, it was better than staying. I closed the door quietly behind me and took a deep breath, orienting myself. The arguing voices still came from the front of the cabin, but they had grown more heated. I moved along the cabin wall until I reached the corner, then paused, listening. From here, I could make out fragments of the argument. "Told you not tonight," Roy was saying. "Too risky with the truck still out there." "Don't care," Mitch replied, his voice surprisingly high for a man his size. "Claire says it has to be tonight. Says she saw." "Claire worries too much," Roy interrupted. "We've been careful. No one's connected anything." "The wallets," Mitch insisted. "You keep the damn wallets like trophies. Someone's going to—" "Enough!" Roy's voice cracked like a whip. "I'm handling it. Go back to town. Tell Claire everything's fine." A tense silence followed, broken only by the soft hooting of an owl somewhere in the forest. Then Mitch spoke again, his voice lower now, threatening. "If you don't take care of it, I will. Tonight." That was all I needed to hear. It was clearly me, and take care of wasn't likely to mean a warm bed and breakfast. I slipped away from the cabin, keeping low, and made for the tree line. The ground was uneven, scattered with pine needles and fallen branches that seemed determined to trip me with every step. Still, I moved as quickly as I dared, the adrenaline in my system sharpening my senses. I reached the forest edge just as I heard the SUV's engine start up. Headlights swept across the clearing as the vehicle turned, briefly illuminating me before I ducked behind a massive pine. The SUV accelerated down the dirt track, its taillights soon swallowed by darkness. I plunged deeper into the forest, using the moon's faint light to guide me. I had to find the road, flag down a passing car, get to a phone. Anything to put distance between myself and whatever Roy and Mitch had planned. Behind me, I heard the cabin door slam, followed by Roy's voice, calling my name. He knew I was gone. The hunt had begun. The forest closed around me like a fist. Pine boughs slapped at my face, roots and rocks conspired to trip me, and the darkness between the trees was absolute. Only patches of moonlight filtering through the canopy offered any guidance. I moved as quickly as I dared, trying to maintain a straight line while listening for pursuit. Roy's voice echoed through the trees, growing fainter as I put distance between us. "Ethan! Come on, man. It's dangerous out there. Bears, coyotes, you don't know these woods." I almost laughed at that. Bears and coyotes were the least of my concerns right now. I kept moving, using the slope of the land to orient myself. Downhill should eventually lead to the road, I reasoned, or at least to a creek that might lead to civilization. The ground grew steeper, forcing me to grab at saplings and branches to control my descent. My breathing came in ragged gasps, sweat trickling down my back despite the chill night air. I wasn't in terrible shape for a truck driver, but this mad scramble through unfamiliar terrain was pushing my limits. A branch snapped somewhere behind me, not close, but close enough to renew my urgency. I picked up my pace, half running, half sliding down the increasingly steep slope. The trees were thinning now, which meant better visibility but less cover. Suddenly, my foot caught on an exposed root, and I was falling, tumbling down the hillside in an uncontrolled roll. Rocks and branches battered my body as I desperately tried to slow my descent. I came to a stop against the trunk of a massive pine, the impact knocking the wind from my lungs. For several long moments, I lay there, struggling to breathe, my entire body throbbing with new bruises. When I finally managed to sit up, I assessed the damage. Nothing seemed broken, though my right ankle protested sharply when I put weight on it. Sprained, most likely. My jacket was torn, and I could feel blood trickling from a cut on my forehead. I leaned against the tree, listening. The forest had gone quiet. No voice calling my name. No snapping branches or crunching footsteps. Had I lost him? Or was Roy simply moving more carefully now, stalking rather than pursuing? The thought spurred me back into motion. I pushed away from the tree, testing my injured ankle. It hurt, but it would bear my weight if I was careful. I moved downhill again, more cautiously this time, following what appeared to be a game trail winding through the trees. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, the forest began to thin further. The slope gentled, and ahead, I could see a break in the trees. Not a clearing, but the wider space of a road or fire break. Hope surged through me, giving fresh energy to my tired legs. I emerged onto a dirt road, narrow and rutted, but definitely a road. In the moonlight, I could see tire tracks in the dust. Someone had driven here recently. Which direction would lead to the highway? I hesitated, trying to recall the twists and turns Roy had taken to reach his cabin. A sound from the forest behind me made the decision for me. A branch snapping, followed by a soft curse. Roy was still on my trail. I turned left, purely on instinct, and began to jog along the road, ignoring the protests from my ankle. The packed dirt was infinitely easier to navigate than the forest floor, allowing me to move faster despite my injury. The road curved and dipped, following the contours of the land. After about half a mile, it joined a wider gravel road, still not paved, but clearly more heavily traveled. I picked up my pace again, the loose stones crunching beneath my boots. My breath fogged in the night air, and my lungs burned with exertion, but fear kept me moving. Behind me, too close for comfort, came the unmistakable sound of an engine starting up. Headlights appeared at the junction where I'd emerged from the forest road. Roy had gone back for his truck. Panic gave me a fresh burst of speed. I sprinted now, my ankle a distant throb beneath the flood of adrenaline. The gravel road straightened, running alongside what appeared to be a shallow ravine. Ahead I could see the glow of lights, not the warm yellow of house lights, but the cooler white of street lamps or highway lights. The engine behind me grew louder, the headlights casting my elongated shadow before me like a herald of doom. I risked a glance back and saw Roy's blue pickup less than 100 yards behind, gaining quickly. In moments, he would be alongside me, and I had nowhere to hide on this exposed stretch of road. A crazy idea formed in my mind. The ravine to my right was maybe 15 feet deep, its sides steep but not vertical. At the bottom ran a creek, its water glinting in the moonlight. If I could reach it without breaking my neck, I might be able to follow it to wherever those lights were coming from. The truck was 50 yards back now. I could hear the engine roaring as Roy pushed it to its limits on the rough road. It was now or never. I veered right, leaping over the edge of the ravine. For a moment I was airborne, the creek flashing below me. Then I hit the slope, my feet sliding out from under me, and I was rolling again, dirt and leaves filling my mouth, rocks battering my already bruised body. I landed in the creek with a splash, the frigid water shocking the breath from my lungs. It was shallow, barely knee-deep, but moving swiftly over a rocky bed. Above me on the road, I heard the pickup skid to a halt. A door slammed, and Roy's voice carried down to where I lay half submerged. "I see you down there, Ethan. This is stupid. Let me help you." Help me right into a shallow grave, no doubt. I scrambled to my feet, water streaming from my clothes, and began to wade downstream toward the distant lights. The creek bed was treacherous, full of slippery rocks and unexpected holes, but far preferable to facing whatever Roy had planned. Behind me, I heard Roy cursing, followed by the sound of someone sliding down the ravine slope. He was coming after me on foot. I pushed harder, struggling against the current, my soaked clothes dragging at me like weights. The lights were growing closer. I could make out individual street lamps now, illuminating what appeared to be the back of a building. Another few hundred yards, and I'd be within shouting distance of potential help. A splash behind me warned that Roy had reached the creek. I didn't look back, focusing all my energy on forward motion. The water was numbing my feet, making each step an act of concentrated will. My injured ankle threatened to buckle with every uneven placement. Just as I thought I might collapse from exhaustion, the creek curved around a stand of willows. And suddenly, I was looking at the back of what appeared to be a gas station. Light spilled from its windows, and I could make out the shapes of fuel pumps at the front. A single car was parked beside the building, its engine running, exhaust condensing in the cold air. I staggered out of the creek, up the gentle bank, and toward the light like a drowning man toward air. Behind me, I heard Roy's labored breathing, and knew he was close. Too close. As I rounded the corner of the gas station, I nearly collided with a woman emerging from the side door, car keys in hand. She was middle-aged, with short gray hair and an expression of utter shock as she took in my bedraggled appearance. "Please," I gasped. "Help me. Man chasing me. Dangerous." She hesitated only a moment before grabbing my arm and pulling me toward her car, a sensible blue sedan. "Get in," she ordered, her voice brooking no argument. I practically fell into the passenger seat as she slid behind the wheel. Through the rear window, I saw Roy emerge from the darkness at the edge of the property, his face contorted with rage. He froze when he saw me in the car, clearly calculating his options. The woman reversed sharply, swinging the car around to face the road. Roy made one desperate lunge toward us, but she accelerated hard, spraying gravel in his face. In moments, we were on the highway, the gas station, and Roy receding in the rearview mirror. "Thank you," I managed, teeth chattering with cold and residual fear. He was going to kill me. The woman glanced at me, her expression a mixture of concern and wariness. "That was Roy Chambers, wasn't it? What in God's name were you doing with him?" I explained as best I could. The breakdown, the ride to Leland, Mitch's warning, the escape. As I spoke, the woman's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "We need to go to the police," she said when I finished. "Right now." "Do you know him?" I asked. "Roy?" She nodded grimly. "Everyone around here knows Roy. Or knows to stay away from him. There have been rumors for years. Missing travelers, strange noises from his property at night. Police have investigated a few times, but they never find anything." She glanced at me again. "You're the first one I've heard of who got away." 20 minutes later, we pulled into the parking lot of a small sheriff's station in a town called Riverside, a place that, unlike Leland, actually appeared on maps. The woman, who had introduced herself as Margaret Holloway, a local schoolteacher, insisted on accompanying me inside. I was grateful for her presence as I recounted my story to a skeptical deputy. "Roy Chambers again," he sighed, making notes. "Look, Mr. Hargrove, I'm not saying I don't believe you, but we've had complaints about Roy before, and we've never found anything concrete. Man's odd, no question, keeps to himself, but that's not a crime." "What about Mitch?" I asked. "He seemed to be involved too. Big guy, shaved head." The deputy frowned. "Mitchell Deaver? Works maintenance at the high school?" He shook his head. "Now I know you're confused. Mitch couldn't hurt a fly. Simplest man you'll ever meet." Margaret leaned forward. "Deputy Carson, with all due respect, something happened to this man tonight. Look at him." The deputy surveyed my muddy, bloody, soaking wet appearance and nodded reluctantly. "All right, I'll send a car out to Roy's place, check things out, and we'll look into your truck situation. In the meantime, you should get cleaned up, maybe see a doctor about that ankle." It wasn't the decisive action I'd hoped for, but it was something. Margaret offered to drive me to the nearest motel, and I accepted gratefully, limping back to her car with the deputy's promise to call once they had news about my truck. As we drove away from the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had escaped something truly horrific. and that others before me had not been so fortunate. The cheap motel shower washed away the mud and blood, but not the fear. It lingered like a stain on my psyche, coloring every thought, every motion. I kept the bathroom door open while I washed, unwilling to be completely enclosed in any space. Every creak of the building, every passing car outside, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. Margaret had waited in the lobby, insisting she wouldn't leave until she knew I was settled safely. She'd even stopped at a 24-hour Walmart for basic supplies, clean clothes, bandages, a toothbrush. Small-town hospitality, she'd called it with a sad smile, to make up for what you experienced. When I emerged from the bathroom, dressed in loose sweatpants and a t-shirt that still smelled of the store, she was on the phone with the sheriff's office. Her expression told me everything I needed to know before she even hung up. "They went to Roy's cabin," she said quietly. "He was there, calm as could be. Said he'd given a stranded trucker a ride to town, but the man had wandered off from the diner, claimed he was worried and went looking for you." "And they believed him?" I asked incredulously. Margaret sighed. "They said there was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of anything illegal. Just a lonely man in a cabin in the woods." She hesitated. "They did find your truck, though. Tow truck got there about an hour after you left with Roy. It's at Jenkins' garage in Riverside now." Relief flooded through me at that news. My rig was safe, at least. I'd have to answer to the company about abandoning it, but that was a small price to pay for being alive. "What about Mitch?" I asked. "Did they talk to him?" "Mitchell Deaver was at home with his wife all evening, according to the police. Has an alibi for the entire night." I shook my head, confused. "That's impossible. I saw him at the diner, then at Roy's cabin. He was arguing with Roy about taking care of me." Margaret's expression was troubled. "Ethan, I've known Mitch Deaver my whole life. He's worked at the high school for 20 years. He coaches Little League in the summer. He's not the kind of man who conspirates to hurt strangers." "Then who did I see?" I asked, doubt creeping into my voice for the first time. Had the stress of the breakdown, the isolation, the strange town made me imagine things? Was Roy just an eccentric local who'd genuinely been trying to help? No. I couldn't accept that. The wallets in the cabin, the argument I'd overheard, the pursuit through the woods, those weren't hallucinations. "Get some rest," Margaret advised, standing to leave. "Things will be clearer in the morning. The garage opens at 8. They'll tell you what's wrong with your truck." I thanked her again for her help, and she left me alone with my thoughts and the growing uncertainty about what had actually happened that night. Sleep came in fits and starts, haunted by dreams of pursuit through endless woods, of Roy's pale eyes watching me from the darkness, of massive hands closing around my throat. I woke shortly after dawn, exhausted but relieved to see sunlight streaming through the thin motel curtains. The garage was a 10-minute walk from the motel. My ankle throbbed with each step, but the pain was clarifying, a physical reminder that the previous night had been real, whatever its true nature. Jenkins' garage turned out to be a sprawling compound of buildings, service bays, and a gravel lot filled with vehicles in various states of repair. My Peterbilt sat at the far end, looking strangely vulnerable with its hood still open. The mechanic confirmed what I already knew. The alternator was shot, and the radiator had a hairline crack. Parts would have to be ordered, which meant at least 2 days of delay. I called my dispatcher, explained the situation, and weathered the expected reprimand for leaving the truck unattended. "Could have been stripped for parts," he grumbled, though we both knew that was unlikely on such a remote stretch of highway. With nothing to do but wait, I decided to check out Riverside properly. It was a normal small town, a main street with shops, a diner that looked nothing like the one in Leland, a public library, a high school. People nodded politely as I passed, a few giving curious glances to my obvious limp and the bandage on my forehead. On impulse, I stepped into the library and asked to see a local map. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, spread one out on a table for me. "Looking for anything in particular?" she asked. "A town called Leland," I replied. "Should be about 15 miles off Route 287. She frowned, scanning the map. "Leland? Never heard of it. Let me check." She consulted the map's index, then shook her head. "No Leland listed here. Are you sure about the location?" I traced my finger along Route 287, finding the approximate area where my truck had broken down. There was nothing there on the map. No town, not even a road leading into the hills where Roy's cabin had been. "Maybe it's too small to be on the map," I suggested. "Possible," she agreed. "But I've lived in this county for 40 years, and I've never heard of a town called Leland. There's a Leesville about 60 miles north, though." I thanked her and left, more confused than ever. Had I misheard the name? No, Roy had definitely called it Leland. I remembered clearly. On my way back to the motel, I stopped at the sheriff's office, hoping for any updates. Deputy Carson was on duty again, looking tired and slightly irritated to see me. "Mr. Hargrove." He greeted me without enthusiasm. "What can I do for you?" "I was wondering if you'd learned anything more about Roy Chambers," I said. "Or about the town of Leland." He sighed, pushing back his hat to scratch his forehead. "We went out to Roy's place again this morning, did a more thorough check. Nothing suspicious found." "What about the wallets?" I pressed. "I saw them on a table in his cabin, 5 or 6 trucker wallets." "No wallets found," Carson replied flatly. "Just the usual cabin stuff. As for Leland, there is no town called Leland in this county, Mr. Hargrove. Never has been." "But I was there," I insisted. "A diner, a gas station, a few other buildings. Roy took me there after my truck broke down." Carson's expression shifted from irritation to something like pity. "Look, I'm not saying you're making this up. Breaking down in the middle of nowhere can be disorienting. Maybe Roy did give you a ride, and maybe you stopped somewhere that he called Leland. But it's not a real town, at least not around here." I left the station feeling like I was losing my grip on reality. Had I imagined the entire experience? The diner, Claire, Mitch, the wallets, the chase. Had stress and exhaustion conjured an elaborate hallucination? I returned to the motel, intending to rest until my head cleared, but there was someone waiting for me. Margaret, looking pale and worried. "We need to talk," she said simply. We walked to a nearby park, finding a bench away from the few people enjoying the spring sunshine. Margaret seemed reluctant to speak, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "What is it?" I prompted gently. "Last night, after I left you, I started thinking about what you said. About Mitch being at Roy's cabin." She took a deep breath. "The police say Mitch was home all evening, but that's not entirely true. He missed his shift at the school yesterday, called in sick. His wife told everyone he was home with the flu, but no one actually saw him until late in the evening." Hope flared in me, validation that I hadn't imagined everything. "So he could have been with Roy?" Margaret nodded reluctantly. "It's possible. There's something else, too. I asked around about Roy Chambers this morning. Carefully, you understand. People don't like to talk about him much." "What did you find out?" "He moved here about 8 years ago. Keeps to himself, like the deputy said. But there have been rumors. Hunters who've gone missing in the hills near his cabin. A census worker who never returned from that area. Nothing ever proven. Nothing that would warrant more than a cursory investigation." She hesitated, then continued. "There's an old ghost town up in those hills. It was a mining camp in the 1890s, abandoned when the silver ran out. Some locals say Roy lives near there, that he's restored parts of it. They call it Leland's Hollow, after the original mine owner, A chill ran through me despite the warm sun. Leland. That's where he took me. But it wasn't a ghost town. There were people there, a diner. Margaret's eyes met mine, troubled and uncertain. Were there? Or was it just Roy and maybe Mitch and your mind filled in the rest? Old buildings can look inhabited in the right light. I considered this. Could stress and fear have caused me to populate an abandoned town with imaginary figures? Could Claire the waitress, the elderly couple, the shadowy figure following us? Could they all have been projections of my anxious mind? I don't know anymore, I admitted, but I know what I saw in Roy's cabin. Those wallets were real, and someone chased me through those woods. I believe you, Margaret said simply, but I don't think the police will, not without evidence. We parted with a promise to stay in touch. Margaret gave me her phone number, made me swear to call if I remembered anything else, or if Roy showed up again. I spent the rest of the day in my motel room, door locked, curtains drawn, replaying every moment of that night in my mind, trying to separate reality from possible hallucination. 2 days later, my truck was repaired. I paid the bill, thanked the mechanics, and called Margaret to say goodbye. She made me promise to be careful, to stick to main highways, to avoid lonely stretches of road at night. I assured her I would and left Riverside behind, my encounter with Roy Chambers and the mysterious town of Leland already taking on the quality of a bad dream. It wasn't until I was 50 miles away, heading east toward my delayed delivery in Casper, that I discovered something in the pocket of my repaired jacket, something I'd forgotten in the chaos of that night. A matchbook from Claire's Diner, Leland, Wyoming, with a phone number scrawled inside. A number I never called, too afraid of what, or who, might answer. That was 27 years ago. I quit driving trucks a month later, couldn't handle the isolation of the open road anymore, the vulnerability of those empty stretches of highway. I found work at a hardware store in my hometown, married, had kids, built a normal life. But I still check the news from Wyoming occasionally. Still look for reports of missing travelers, abandoned vehicles, unexplained disappearances. Over the years, there have been a few. Not many, just enough to make me wonder. And sometimes on cold nights when sleep won't come, I find myself thinking about a town that doesn't exist, and a man with pale eyes who hunts in the darkness, and I wonder how many weren't as lucky as I was. Because the truest horror isn't in the supernatural or the impossible. It's in the realization that monsters walk among us wearing human faces, and that sometimes the only difference between survival and becoming another forgotten victim is blind, dumb luck, and the kindness of a stranger willing to stop for a man running out of the dark.